and welcome to Jay Coletti's Racket Reviews. My name is Jay Coletti, and I will be your hostess. Here on Racket Reviews, we are dedicated to learning about all things organized crime, and today I thought it would be fun to try something new with you, and seeing as though Valentine's Day is just a couple days away, gentlemen, there's still time, I thought it would be fun to discuss the various love interests of everyone's favorite television mobster, Tony Soprano. If you're enjoying the channel and would like to become a Racket Reviews patron, please head on over to that Patreon account and join the Coletti family. Now, without further ado, we have much to discuss. So let's get right to it. In Mafia entertainment, as in any form of entertainment, you will have character types that you can predictably expect to make an appearance in your favorite movie, TV show, or book. While there is a ton of content online about the male archetypes of fictional mafiosi, I thought it might be fun to mix it up and cover the female romantic interests of Don Soprano, which I actually find transcends the show itself and sets up the sort of modern femme fatale that we see in most mafia entertainment. Let's begin with the classic mob lady, and that's of course the mob wife. Always willing to look the other way regarding her husband's business, and frequently able to look the other way when it comes to his infidelity, the characteristics of a perfect mob wife are exemplified in the character of Carmela Soprano. Of course, it's a show, and, of course, infidelity wears on a marriage, so the subject of Tony's inability to stay faithful is a regular and fascinating source of conflict. One of the qualities that I really love about the mob wife archetype in types of shows like The Sopranos is that, although not at first, these women are shown to have enormous sway over their husbands. This is reflected in real life in the case of and the records we have of his conversations in prison, terrified that his wife would find out about his infidelity. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. We see this issue of infidelity come to a head in The Sopranos season 4 when Carmela and Tony have their time of separation, wherein Tony is living at Whitecaps, the pretentious beach house he and Carmela were supposed to enjoy together. Without Carmela, Tony sleeps on the floor of an empty idea. During their time apart, we see that Tony treats his home away from Carmela the same way a typical teenage boy treats his room. Grimy, no decoration, barely functional. What this demonstrates to us is that Carmela, although not always a great wife, is an excellent homemaker. Carmela is shown throughout the series struggling with her Catholic faith. She knows what she should be doing, and she also knows what Tony should be doing. However, one of her biggest flaws in the show is her inability to stick with her convictions, and this goes across the board to all mob wives, as it were, as the archetype. We see Carmela trade her values for what Tony gives her almost every single time. On the other hand, as demonstrated by the way Tony lives without her, she turns all of this money that Tony makes into something worth having. Given Carmela's faith as demonstrated in the show, I think it's important that we dig a little deeper to get a clearer understanding of the character's worldview. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 31, starting in verse 10, we get the biblical description of the good woman or the good wife. I won't read it all to you, but if you're interested in reading one of the most beautiful representations of womanhood, and if you're looking for something sweet to read to that special someone because you forgot Valentine's Day was coming up, I've got your back. But for today's purposes, let's go ahead and take Proverbs 31 and just take some of the highlights to get a sense of what Carmela views as what she should be doing. In verse 15, Proverbs 31 says, "She riseth also while it is yet night, and giveth meat to her household, and a portion to her maidens." So we can see in the first half that Carmela is extremely dedicated to her family and works tirelessly to give them all that she can. But in doing so, she does not give a portion to her maidens, or the synonyms of servants, or those who work for her in the Soprano family. In fact, she's quite greedy. She doesn't give a fig about those beneath her, except on the occasion she's having a moral crisis, but even then, she always sides with money. Furthermore, verse 20 expands on the idea, "She stretcheth out her hand to the poor, yea, she reacheth forth her hands to the needy." That's hardly Carmela. Carmela's faith and battle to stand by it makes it clear to me that Carmela understands the specifics of Proverbs 31 and no doubt desires to abide by them. Although to be fair, any woman who tries to abide by the Proverbs 31 description of womanhood, myself included, will willingly admit that it's a hard mark to hit. Of course, the beginning of the description of this virtuous woman begins as follows. "Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies." A virtuous wife is a rare find, and unfortunately for Carmela, though sometimes she does try to rise above it, she is bought and paid for with a price. She is constantly choosing the rubies of this world and those that Tony can give her instead of her convictions. She falls short of the mark. While Carmela does not meet the biblical qualifications for a good wife, she is a perfect representation of a mob wife. In addition to the classic mob wife, we also have this constructed version of the ideal woman as in the minds of mafiosi who admittedly in the show watch The Godfather over and over and over again to inform them how they should behave. With that being said, this ideal woman very much falls into the category of what we see as Apollonia in The Godfather. So somebody who's young and kind and gentle and beautiful and virginal and motherly and, of course, Italian. This girl has to meet all of these qualifications, and she has to be somebody that's worth showing off. This is all falling very much into a type of Madonna character. However, Tony was a product of the end of the 20th century, so this woman would also have to be modern at the exact same time. Essentially, on top of having all of the Apollonia qualities, she needed to be educated. So a foreign exchange student with a deep connection to her home in Avellino, where we find out Tony's grandfather is from, would be ideal. And this ideal woman came in the form of Isabella, the foreign exchange student who is conveniently taking care of his neighbor's home while they're away, and she is simply perfect. Too perfect. Even her name, Isabella, the Italian derivative of Elizabeth, or Elisheba in Hebrew, meaning God is my oath, basically cries out to us that she is like the Madonna. She doesn't even give a last name. Spoiler alert, we find out at the end of this episode that this woman is a complete figment of Tony's imagination, a hallucination brought on by the constant taking of the lithium medicine. A perfect beauty, a perfect student, a perfect American, a perfect Italian, and, according to Tony's further hallucination, wherein they live together in an old world home, a perfect mother nursing their son named Anthony. The show, by way of Dr. Melfi, explains that perhaps it is also that Tony wishes this ideal woman, in addition to being his lover, would have been the type of woman he had for a mother. Tony would take what Dr. Melfi says and extrapolate that this actually means that he wants to sleep with his mother, and then he would proceed to learn very little about women from this interaction. Even though Tony didn't want to follow that thought through, I think it's worthwhile for us on Racket Reviews to follow that through. It's clear that movies such as The Godfather have influenced Tony's tastes and behaviors. It would be a great feather in his cap to have an ideal woman such as Apollonia as his lover, and the woman who would bear him male heirs and maintain a firm, idyllic connection to the old country. And it's evident throughout the series that Tony desires hardly anything more than to be really truly considered an old school gangster. On the other hand, this woman would need to meet the qualifications of an exemplary American. So, an ideal woman would have to challenge Tony academically, but she can't be smarter than him, of course. Her English is self-described as pitiful, and we have her conversations peppered with the big doe-eyed como se dice all throughout the entire time she's talking to Tony. It would make sense that this woman was an exchange student, so that way she could stay perfectly Italian, but would be perfectly American by way of her education. Here's the issue, of course, is that woman doesn't exist. Now, am I saying that a beautiful Italian exchange student who's very intelligent doesn't exist? No. But what I am saying is that she is actually an individual human being with a last name. Watch the episode again. It's clear that the woman is a hallucination. Everything about her is actually about Tony. When she talks about her life in Italy, she asks him if he has ever been, then weaves in lovely little stories about what it's like there. She guesses that Tony's family is from Avellino, same as hers, and on top of that, Tony is enchanted with her and argues with his wife about her in his hallucination. In this imaginary argument, Carmela talks about how she bends over backwards for him and that he's tearing the family apart with his whining and complaining. Carmela also says some things in this hallucination that I am not at liberty to repeat on this channel. This is a family show, but the reason I bring up Carmela is because in his hallucination, Carmela is jealous because this woman gives him everything that he could ever want, and Carmela is constantly tearing him down in his mind. All of this represents an ideal woman in Tony's imagination, a woman he has had neither as a mother nor as a wife, and when he's near her, he can barely speak. It should be noted also that in this episode, Tony's mother was actually one of the key players behind an assassination attempt on him. It's a lot. This show always zigs when you think it's going to zag. Let's move on to some shallower women in Tony's life. Naturally, any good drama is going to have a character who's obsessed with the protagonist. Can we call Tony a protagonist? Well, he's the main character anyway. For this obsessive mistress, we get the Mercedes saleswoman Gloria Trillo. Trillo literally has borderline personality disorder, just like Tony's mother, And while Trillo is an extremely gratifying lover, she causes nothing but issues in Tony's life, from calling his home to essentially threatening Carmela when she drives her home from the dealership. There's not really too much to add to her character as far as a type goes. The obsessive, crazy lover who's super gratifying but also super toxic that's always a good addition to any drama. Naturally, the writers of The Sopranos managed to make her feel fresh and like a genuine threat to Tony's marriage, but ultimately a crazy, possessive mistress is always a winner when it comes to entertainment value. Ultimately, Trillo is the incarnate representation of Tony's issue with women, stemming from the problems and difficulties he experienced with his mother and his need for approval from women like her. Sadly, this approval can never be realized for Tony, which is the cause of his womanizing even though he has Carmela at home and is terrified of losing her. Tony is ultimately dissatisfied in his marriage and seeks these other women because being a husband and father comes along with several responsibilities. The best husbands and fathers are the ones who got the fulfillment in their young life as being sons who were loved unconditionally. Because Tony never had that, he spends his time chasing lovers that he is trying to force to fill the role only a mother can. Compelling stuff. In a similar vein, you have another unfortunate, but let's face it, entertaining representation of a woman in Tony's main gumar, Irina, the gold digger. Peltson is not interested in Tony's personal life. She doesn't want to hear it. She wants fancy dinners, she wants expensive gifts, she wants to be treated like a princess, and she wants to be wanted. In a way, if Carmela represents the perfect mob wife, Irina represents the perfect gumar. In that way, it makes sense that she's the first of Tony's girlfriends to whom we are introduced in the series. In fact, it was Irina who called Carmela heartbroken that the man they both loved had cheated on them with her cousin Svetlana. More on Svetlana in a moment. The call from Irina is what triggered Carmela kicking Tony out of the house for the first time in the series. It was their first huge fight on the show, and the second best fight in the series in my opinion. And all because number 2 called number 1 with the shared heartache over number 3. When Irina called Carmela, this wasn't a threat. This was her reaching out to have somebody to express how Tony made her feel, and Carmela was the only person who could understand that. A gumar should not be interested in being a mobster's wife. She is a side item, a sexual release. In fact, when Carmela is discussing the fact that she's jealous of Tony's relationship with Dr. Melfi, she insists it's only because it goes beyond the physical. Irina stays in her lane and remains an object of physical affection for Tony. Yes, there is just a general sweetness about her at some moments. She's a broken person, a broken young woman. It's hard not to sympathize, and the audience does find themselves sympathizing with her. A gumar shouldn't be unfeeling or scary like the obsessive mistress, but even in our sympathy, we cannot, and nor should we, according to the laws of this mafia world, have the expectation that her role would ascend to that of a wife. Perhaps what makes her so compelling is the fact that she lives so precisely into her role, and why it was so satisfying, although confusing, to watch Tony fight for her when she took a different lover in Ronald Zellman. Tony didn't want her as a wife, and Irina understood that, but Tony was willing to fight for her, to remain second place, and Irina, bless her heart, was so happy that Tony did that. All she wanted is her knight in white satin armor, as she once told Tony in the show. She wants to be loved, even if it comes with strings attached. This love is fulfilled for her by Tony, and as confusing as it may be, we all sit back as audience members and in the back of our minds whisper, this relationship makes sense. We'll obviously get to Dr. Melfi in a moment, but many times, not just in The Sopranos, but other mob entertainment as well, we see a second lover will take on the role of a counselor or therapist for the mobster. Oftentimes, these women play a direct role in helping us see the mobster express his feelings and concerns and dreams and hopes and all of this, much like a therapist would, except that this woman is also a physical release for the mobster. Sometimes in entertainment with less sophisticated storytelling, being a physical outlet is the only thing the mafioso needed. This is where, in my opinion, you see the separation from great mafia content to entertaining mafia content. Usually the Gumar's therapist arc comes out of a place or time of insecurity for the mobster, much like Tony Soprano when he is seeing Irina Peltson. In her case, however, she fell much more into the gold digger category rather than the therapist category because again, she didn't really care about Tony's problems. It was not until Tony took her friend/cousin, Svetlana Kurkelenko, as his lover that we see this type of counselor role play out with one of his lovers. The role wouldn't last long for her, since she had a harder life than Tony, and by contrast, Tony felt like he was being a whiner. An important element to this lover-therapist character for Tony is that Tony has to remain the center of focus. He has to remain the victim. Nobody can be worse off than him. It's all about Tony. As a brief aside, I find it worth noting that in the popular video game Grand Theft Auto 5, our mobster character Michael DeSanta is shown visiting his therapist early on to establish his character. While I understand that people don't necessarily play GTA 5 for the plot, and that this therapist was not a romantic interest for DeSanta, I just have to say that the DeSanta character and the interactions he had with Dr. Friedlander was an extremely cheap, two-dimensional knockoff of just about every mobster and therapist you've ever seen in entertainment. Far be it me to pass too much judgment on the writers of GTA 5, they're millionaires, I'm not, but every time DeSanta walked onto the scene, I cringed, and the worst part of that cringe was always when he was with Dr. Friedlander, and maybe a huge portion of that cringing just comes from the fact that I know how much work The Sopranos put into creating an authentic Dr. Melfi. If you have watched or read up on any behind-the-scenes details from The Sopranos HBO series, and given my audience, I'm sure you have, you'll know the amount of effort and research that went into developing the character of Dr. Melfi, making her not only believable as a woman and an intellectual, but as an exemplary therapist. It was no easy task. The producers of The Sopranos would have certainly not let an interaction like the following occur. DeSanta asks Dr. Friedlander, "Do you believe in evil?" Dr. Friedlander responds, No, I don't. I'm a man of science. Evil is a construct made by people who wish to indulge their childish fantasies, or by people who wish to judge others. Let me know if you immediately see the issue with Dr. Friedlander's response. Besides the fact that science is the study of what exists and the material world and cannot answer moral, philosophical, or theological questions such as the nature of evil, Dr. Friedlander, if he was any type of psychiatrist, would have never answered such a leading question from his patient. Mark it down. Dr. Melfi, for example, would have simply asked DeSanta, "What do you think?" She might even add, "It doesn't matter what I think, this is about you." Or she would have done a very probing question, "Why do you care what I think?" We see Dr. Melfi deflect questions like that from Tony multiple times throughout the HBO series. If you're going to try to copy a character dynamic, at least make it a good copy, I guess is what I'm saying. Tangent over about GTA 5. But it is important that I bring up Dr. Melfi's role as the therapist and the type of question-answer she gives back and forth with Tony, because the reason Tony develops romantic feelings for her is because their conversations are all about him, and Tony Soprano is a narcissist. Tony Soprano truly believed that he was at the forefront of everyone's mind, which is why he never met anyone whom he believed had a neutral opinion of him. Everyone either loved him or hated him. It's what makes Tony such an exquisite main character. We in the audience are expected to have a strong opinion of him. The opinion we have of Tony is the opinion that Tony has of himself given any particular moment. We love him and love watching him when he's in love with himself, and we hate him and hate watching him when he's down on himself. As the audience, we can expect that our entrance into the world will revolve around Tony and characters will interact primarily with him, and will be unrealistically focused on him since this is a fictional story and he is our leading man. However, after the revelation that Tony is a narcissist, we're forced to look back on all of the episodes that we've watched and realize that not only have we been watching a show about Tony, we've been watching the show through Tony. The fact that we discover this about Tony organically as the series unfolds is what makes The Sopranos such a wonderful and rewatchable show. Seriously, watch the show again a second time if you haven't already, with this view in mind, and look at how every character is assumed to either love or hate Tony. There's never somebody who doesn't really care. It's because of this worldview that Tony has of himself that we can see the exact moments where his romantic escapades begin descending into failure, the moment the woman is no longer interested primarily in Tony. Everything has to be focused on him, but especially his romantic relationships, even broader, especially his relationships with women. I am under the impression that many mobsters are themselves narcissists. It's probably part of the reason why so many ex-mobsters can't resist the deal of getting a book or TV show. Because of that core similarity with real-life mafiosi, Tony Soprano feels very authentic, and his constant referencing to The Godfather in particular is because that is how he sees himself, or how he wants to. Superior, unburdened by typical rules of right and wrong, an outcast in society, and yet a societal lightning rod. He thinks the world revolves around him. Making a show from the perspective of a narcissist is exactly what makes The Sopranos so fascinating. And Dr. Melfi being able to discover this right under our noses is what makes her such an unbelievable therapist. And then GTA 5 comes along, misses the entire masterstroke of The Sopranos, and instead tries to ham-fist its doctor-patient relationship that insults the intelligence of the audience member. Can you tell that that scene with that doctor from GTA 5 sent me into a tailspin? I'm sorry to keep talking about it when I'm supposed to be talking about The Sopranos, but I'm sorry, I know that the point of GTA 5 is that you get to drive fast cars really fast, but the complete lack of thought that went into that interaction with DeSanta and Friedlander completely took me out of the story. Ultimately, therapy is unsuccessful for Tony as Dr. Melfi realizes that as a sociopath, Tony is beyond treatment, and she shows him the door. Just like the relationship with all of the women in his life, his relationship with Dr. Melfi was a failure. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Racket Reviews discussing the various love interests of Tony Soprano. I am not a film critic by trade by any stretch of the imagination, so make sure to let me know in the comment section below or on Facebook and Twitter what you think about Tony Soprano's love interests and if you've enjoyed this type of show. Also, don't forget to utilize the comment section and social media to let me know about who or what you would like to see covered next. I always love hearing from you, and I'm always happy to investigate. Make sure to like, subscribe, and click notifications to get more Mafia content sent directly to your sub box. Ciao.